Hey guys, welcome to another huge episode of Triggered. I hope everyone is having a great week, and it's great to be with you guys as always. We have an important show today, a deep dive into the transactional crime cartels. Basically Cuba, at least some of the bad actors in Venezuela, Mexico, so much more, because for years, Washington treated especially Cuba like a museum exhibit. Everyone knew the regime was brutal. Everyone knew the economy was a disaster. Everyone knew the Cuban people were being crushed and were suffering greatly. But there wasn't the sense of urgency to actually do anything about it, right? There's all talk, no action, the usual. Now, the Trump administration is putting real pressure on the communist regime in Havana. Economic pressure, legal pressure, diplomatic pressure, military pressure, and a very clear message that the era of Cuban acting like an untouchable communist outpost in the Western Hemisphere may finally be coming to an end. On May 20th, the Department of Justice unsealed a superseding indictment charging Raul Castro and 5 other Castro regime's defendants for their roles in the 1996 shoot-down of 2 civilian aircraft over international waters. 3 American citizens were killed. Families waited for 30 years for accountability. That's a big deal, because dictatorships survive by programming people to believe that time erases everything, all of the crimes, all of the brutality, all of it, that the victims will be forgotten. But we deserve a foreign policy that notices when a hostile regime 90 miles away from Florida, who works with our enemies to export leftist terrorism all over the place. So we're actually dealing with it, which is kind of nice. Today, we'll have Marshall Billingslea back on the show. He previously served as an assistant secretary for terrorist financing at the Treasury Department. He led international efforts to counter illicit financial activity. He served as president of the Financial Action Task Force, and he worked extensively on the intersection of money, sanctions, national security, and hostile regimes. So guys, make sure to check out this show. Make sure you're liking, okay? Hit the like button. It's so easy. If you're watching right now, it takes half a second. Just do that. Share this with your friends. Subscribe so you never miss one of these major episodes. If you do miss the show here on Rumble, go over to Apple, go over to Spotify, catch it there. For all of the top headlines that we cover here on the show, go over to my news app, MXM News, like minute by minute, MXM, Mike X-Ray Mike, okay? Where you can get the mainstream news without the mainstream bias. And of course, don't forget about our brave sponsors for having the guts to actually support this program, okay? If you're going to be checking out stuff anyway, might as well support those who share your values. Check them out down below and in the video description. But again, it takes guts to do this, so support those who share your values. That's a big part of what we're doing this. So first, check out all the latest predictions on Polymarket. So if you follow politics, you know everyone's got an opinion. But on Polymarket, you actually get real odds on what's likely to happen. Polymarket is a prediction market where people trade on real events, elections, debates, policy moves, and it doesn't stop at politics. There are markets on the economies, tech, sports, pop culture, and so much more. It's all live, it's transparent, and it gives you a real-time indicator of what people really think is going to happen. So go give it a look at polymarket.com, check it out, and let me know what you think. And guys, we have another familiar face sponsoring the show now, Goldco. Gold just surged past $5,000 an ounce. Silver blew past 100. And the U.S. just added silver to the critical mineral list, meaning it's now considered crucial for American security and economic survival. This isn't speculation, this is real. That's why I've renewed my partnership with the #1 rated gold company, Goldco. A+ rated by the BBB, the Better Business Bureau, and they've helped Americans place over $3 billion in gold and silver. So visit donjrgold.com, DONJR gold.com, to get a free 2026 gold and silver kit. And because you're part of this audience, you get up to 10% back in bonus silver or gold just for getting started. Again, that's donjrgold.com. Do it now. Educate yourself. What do you have to lose? Joining me now, former Trump Treasury official Marshall Billingslea. Marshall, great to have you back on the show. How are you?
I'm great, and it's great to be with you today.
So I really appreciate it. Maybe let's start at the high level. Let's start at 36,000 feet. People hear Cuba, and they think this is sort of an old story. The Cold War, Castro, sanctions, and nothing ever changes. Why is this moment actually different?
It's different because of President Trump. It's different because during the Cold War, the Cuban regime was heavily bankrolled by the Soviets and then the Russians. And when they kind of backed out, the Venezuelan regime under Chavez and then Maduro stepped in. But since President Trump has removed Maduro from Venezuela and put Delcy Rodriguez on a very short leash, that revenue, mostly subsidized oil, about a third of what the Cubans needed for all their energy, was given at cut rate prices by the Venezuelan regime. That's all dried up. And so the regime is very, very vulnerable right now. And what you're seeing the administration do is going back to the playbook we executed in the first administration, reimposing a lot of those measures that Obama had taken off and then Biden again took off. And the pressure on the regime is significant and is going to grow even further.
So, you mentioned the regime is vulnerable, but is it as vulnerable as it's ever been, perhaps? Or, do you go through the cycles of vulnerability and we're at somewhere we've seen? Can you take us maybe through some of that history and how that actually looks?
Yeah, they're very vulnerable. I would say they're at their most vulnerable because there is no benefactor to step in and bail them out. The people of the country are they've had it with this regime. They live in absolute abject poverty. And then you have, the grandson of Fidel Castro strutting around as a 33-year-old media influencer with his yachts, and the grandson of Raul Castro strutting around with his Rolexes and his yachts. And they see it. They see it for what it is. So there's a lot of unhappiness. And I don't think it's going to be a huge lift for the Trump administration to push this regime over.
So you mentioned Delcy Rodriguez from Venezuela. Obviously, that was part of the Maduro regime. But it actually seems like, if I'm just being an objective outside looking in, it seems like they're playing pretty good ball with the United States right now.
They are, and I think it's a great credit to the Secretary of State and to the President for how they're playing a very careful, very calibrated game here. By ensuring that there is domestic stability maintained while pressuring the regime to abandon its ties to the likes of Russia, the likes of China, the terrorist groups. By getting control, we now sit basically in control of how the oil revenues are dispersed back to Venezuela. That all comes through a Treasury account here in the United States. So we have a lot to say about making sure that money isn't stolen by Delcy the way she used to be doing it. And time will tell as we see whether we're able to get on a track for elections here. Certainly, I think her plan is to try to slow roll this as best she can. But I think Secretary Rubio and the president know that full well.
Interesting. The Trump administration is putting a lot of pressure on the Cuban regime from multiple directions. Obviously, you have the oil situation, which we've sort of tangentially just discussed. You have sanctions, legal accountability, diplomacy. What do you think the strategy is, sort of in plain English, and the end goals?
So they're doing in this administration basically what we did to Venezuela in the first administration, which is you're going to see the Department of State and the Treasury in support issuing on a periodic but rolling basis further tightening, incremental pressure, incremental tightening of sanctions. The new executive orders that were issued just 26 days after Maduro was snatched so successfully from Caracas, the executive order on Cuba laid out some pretty strenuous sanctions across multiple sectors. So they targeted energy, they targeted finance, defense and security, mining, and so on. But they did some other very interesting things. For the first time, we have the loaded gun of secondary sanctions against any financial institutions that do business with this crowd on the table. And so that's a big warning shot for the banks in Mexico that like to play ball with the Cubans. There are a lot of banks in Spain and a lot of banks in France and Germany that have been playing footsie with the regime, and now they're under threat of sanctions. The other thing they did, which I strongly support, is they put on the table the possibility of sanctioning the adult relatives of corrupt regime officials. So, these kids who are now in their adult years who are living high on the hog because of all the money their father or grandfather stole are at risk themselves of being targeted.
So, what is that goal line? I mean, is it a negotiated transition? Is it regime collapse, new elections, or is it some sort of machination of all of these things, something else?
It's I think probably it'll be you never know with these
Yeah.
dictatorial regimes. Sometimes they collapse. I mean, just look at Syria, right? I mean, it collapsed overnight. But I think probably a negotiated transition is more in the cards. The interesting thing that will make the Cuban evolution different from Venezuela is that you have a longstanding law on the books called the Helms-Burton Act. It was enacted in 1996 by Jesse Helms, who actually I was working for at the time in the Foreign Relations Committee, and Dan Burton. And it lays out, it has, I'd say, two main areas of law that are now going to become very, very relevant. So the first is this thing called Title III, which President Trump, was the first president to allow to go into force. Every president before him had waived application of Title III. But what Title III allows is for U.S. citizens or Cubans who have since moved back into the United States, who had their property expropriated, they can file suit in U.S. courts to get that property back. So this will be a case where the matter of who goes in and takes over the cobalt nickel mine, which once was owned by Freeport, that'll be a pretty standard settled matter via the U.S. courts, which you don't really have that for Venezuela. The other important thing is Title II of Helms-Burton, which very clearly in law says what a transitional government is, and by extension, what one is not. And it lays out 5 or 6 criteria, which are the same kinds of criteria that we're pushing Delcy Rodriguez towards, but these are actually set in law. And so it will have to be, a regime transition that has legalized all political activity, that has released all the political prisoners. Delcy still hasn't done that in Venezuela. That has dissolved the repression apparatus. Diosdado is still in Venezuela right now. Hopefully we'll get our hands on him eventually. Organizing and committed to a timetable for organizing free and fair elections. So those are kind of statutory things that will guide what the U.S. Basically, the president will need to certify to Congress that whomever we're playing ball with meets these criteria in order for some of the sanctions to come off and some of the funding flows to go.
So how does it work for regular families? I mean, growing up even in New York and also Florida. I know so many of these Cuban families, they were, super successful people there. You mentioned cobalt and nickel mines, that may be a thing, but, they had to get on a boat overnight and get the hell out of Dodge, or they were probably going to be killed.
Right.
What happens to sort of, those families who had great real estate and homes and, frankly, the opportunity cost of what they could have done had it remained sort of a thriving metropolis as it was when all this disaster started. I mean, it was a very wealthy country. You had a lot of really intelligent people. You had a lot of success.
Yeah.
You had a lot of entrepreneurs. Most of the good ones had to flee, and if they didn't, they probably fared pretty poorly. How do you solve all of that when you had probably 50, 100,000 people that were all creators that fled almost 50 years ago? How do you get them whole or reasonably whole? I mean, there's sort of the clear business is, hey, you can take back over a mine, but what do you do about all that stuff that was just lost in art? And I mean, this was a true disaster for so many of those people and those families.
I mean, a lot of this is not repairable. I mean,
Yeah.
The damage has been done. The Helms-Burton law, that Title III law I mentioned, does allow you to go after whoever took the property and was profiting off the property and to get compensated not just for the original value, but there's an inflationary thing there. But of course, if the regime, it's the regime basically, this super conglomerate called Gaesa that did much of the appropriation. And if the regime just keels over, then clawing that money back from a defunct organization will be hard. You're going to have to go after the foreign bank accounts of the regime members. And let me tell you, they've got plenty of them.
So how much of the Cuban economy does their military, let's call it the military controlled conglomerate really touch? I mean, I know that's a big part of it in a lot of these regimes. They're sort of, there's a president, but, it's like the IRGC. They sort of control, a country from within. What people may not know is that there's this, Cuban business mega conglomerate owned and operated by the Cuban Revolutionary Armed Forces. How do you go after that?
Don, your analogy to the IRGC is spot on. I mean, it's a very similar business model with the vicious, regime inner circle, military inner circle that dominates the economy. This conglomerate, Gaesa, easily 50%, many estimates put it closer to 70% of the Cuban economy is controlled by this outfit. And they have got their fingers in everything. They control the ports, they control the tourism business, they control supermarkets, hundreds of gas stations, they control the currency exchanges, they control all the trade in and out. Basically, any currency conversion is going through their greedy little paws. They control that mining business that I mentioned, which actually was a pretty important business to them that just got sanctioned.
So, I mean, if an American or European tourist stays at a hotel in Cuba, rents a car, sends a remittance, or spends money at a store, I guess if they're going there, and Europe, especially Spain, still has quite a bit of a tourist operation down in Cuba. How much of that money can end up benefiting that regime? How much do they, sort of siphon off at the top? Is that something you'd know?
Well, I mean, it varies by sort of what Medea Benjamin and Hassan Piker are about to learn the hard way, is that if you go down there as a U.S. citizen and you pay money to a regime-controlled hotel to stay there, and you are delivering goods and services in violation of U.S. sanctions, well, that's a felony. So we'll see how that investigation goes. But the regime absolutely benefits from those kinds of transactions. I mean, when they control the hotel, that money goes right into their pockets. When you fill up your rental car at one of their gas stations, ditto. So because they have their tentacles spread throughout the economy, it's very, very difficult, particularly for U.S. citizens, very dangerous for U.S. citizens to go down there and think that they're not potentially running afoul of U.S. sanctions.
So, you mentioned Hassan Piker. I guess I've read about that a little bit. I mean, what's the allegation there, and what do you think actually happens? Because it feels like, there were sort of rules, but under the prior administration, no one sort of enforced those rules, especially against someone who'd be, left-leaning, rules for, me, but not for thee kind of thing. How does that exactly play out? And, is this something, it seems like based on what I saw online, at least, he just keeps putting out the receipts. That doesn't seem to be awesome for his case.
He really should lawyer up and stop yapping because he's not helping himself. My understanding is that Treasury has subpoenaed both of them and wants to look into, for one of the examples I gave, where do they stay, which hotel, and what kind of money did they pay? What were the goods that they were delivering on this so-called humanitarian mission? What kind of regime propaganda were they collaborating with the regime on messaging? Were they meeting with the regime to optimize their social influence campaigns? We know Medea Benjamin did that all the time with the Maduro regime. Code Pink, when we kicked under first President Trump's administration, when we kicked Maduro's goons out of the Venezuelan embassy here, the regime turned around and gave the key cards to the embassy to Code Pink so they could occupy it and keep Juan Guaido's people out. As just an example of how Code Pink was collaborating, they ran a petition campaign to try to get the Biden administration in 2022 to drop charges against Alex Saab, Maduro's bagman. And we know that Code Pink, it takes money from Neville Singham, who is a billionaire in Shanghai, who has in the past cohabitated offices with the Chinese Communist Party's media operations and so on. So there looked to be some communist Chinese money flowing into Code Pink as well. So I think, if they pop the books open on her financing and her financial behaviors, she could be in a lot of trouble.
So, Marshall, can you perhaps talk a little bit about Treasury? Because, we think of Treasury as like sort of, running the IRS and doing with, U.S. currency and these sorts of things. But can you talk about, its involvement as a former Treasury official and how they, can investigate these financial crimes? I mean, it seems to go much deeper than I think most people would understand, the basic notion of Treasury.
Yeah. So after 9/11, we had the commission that was established to look into how did we miss all the indicators and warnings for 9/11. And one of the conclusions was that we did a terrible job of following the money. There were obvious money trails that Al Qaeda had used, bank deposits, credit cards, all kinds of financial transactions that were knowable if we had been looking. Mm-hmm. And so, in response, Congress created a brand new part of the Treasury called Terrorism Financing, Terrorist Financing and Intelligence, TFI. That's an undersecretary level job. And underneath that are four prongs. There is the Assistant Secretary for Intelligence, does exactly what you would think. There was the Assistant Secretary for Terrorist Financing and Financial Crimes, which is the job I had. That is the combination job that sets both the policy, but also does all the foreign engagements. So if you need to go deal with a central bank somewhere, if you need to go deal with a private bank or with a foreign intelligence service, that's what that job does. And then you have the well-known OFAC, right? That's the sanctions engine and the enforcement arm. And then you have FinCEN, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, which is our domestic financial intelligence unit. And that's the organization that receives all the suspicious activity reports that they put in a big data warehouse for law enforcement to look at. That's the outfit. And so that's kind of, if you think about it, that's your warfighting part of the Treasury. Mm-hmm. So when Scott Bessent, the Secretary of the Treasury, gets up and talks about his financial operation against the Iranians, it's those components under TFI that are waging that campaign for him.
So, I mean, if this happened at 9/11, it feels like a lot of those resources were available, before this. But, Scott, and this administration seem to really be actually finally utilizing the full weight and power of the Treasury to actually get these things done. That seems to be effectuating some actual real change.
It absolutely is. I would say he's following in a very similar trajectory as Steve Mnuchin did, in the sense that with Stephen, we also went hyperactive and hyper aggressive, and we were able to bring both the Iranian regime and the Venezuelan regime to their knees financially without any kind of need for American intervention, no boots on the ground, none of that kind of stuff. And I think they're going back to that playbook, which is driving U.S. national security objectives through the financial and economic tools. Yes, some military action here and there, but really using the non-kinetic financial tools to advance the president's agenda. And I would say this is particularly the case in the Western Hemisphere under the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine.
Yeah, it's interesting because, actually utilizing that in our backyard seems to be probably far more important to our interest. The clear and present danger of a dictatorial regime and a narco-terrorist state, literally, essentially on our borders, is more problematic than probably where we'd focused a lot of the Treasury resources. But it's sort of nice to have that in our backyard finally working.
It's refreshing. There are very, very few presidents in my adult life. President Trump is really the only president that has ever paid a great deal of attention to Latin America. And I think he deserves enormous credit. He is following along, there's two different strands of the Monroe Doctrine. There's a much more isolationist version, which is actually what James Monroe had in mind when he promulgated the doctrine. And then you have the Theodore Roosevelt version of the doctrine. And so what President Trump is doing is much more in the heritage of Theodore Roosevelt and those who believed that the United States should be assertive in this hemisphere and that the foreign powers need to stay out. And in Monroe's time, the foreign powers were the Spanish and the French. In President Trump's time, those foreign powers are the Russians, the Chinese, both of whom are active in Cuba, by the way, the Iranians and their terror proxies.
Yeah, it's always interesting when I hear people talk about that. Like, what do we have to do with this? Oh, you only care about the oil. I'm like, yeah, that's exactly what China cares about. Certainly as it relates to Venezuela. Cuba, I imagine, has more to do with proximity to the United States. As a let's call it a launch pad, both literally and figuratively. Right. Why would China care if it wasn't for that? Why would Iran care if it wasn't for that? And so to actually have America care about that seems to matter, in the words of a wise president, bigly.
Absolutely. Look, this is geography, right? We're talking about an island that is 200 miles, give or take, away from U.S. Central Command, U.S. Special Operations Command, all of Florida. And that's why you have roughly 18 different eavesdropping posts on that island, 18 on an island the size of Cuba. So the Russians long operated this massive facility at a place called Lourdes, just outside Havana, where they could pretty much listen to any phone call on the Eastern Seaboard during the Cold War. They gave that up for a little while in the early 2000s, but they came back in 2014 and they're running that eavesdropping site yet again, and another one. And the Chinese are believed to be sitting in 3, maybe 4 different SIGINT collection sites. So yeah, it's a real issue. And you know, there's been recent reporting that maybe the Cubans got their hands on some Iranian drones. That's a pretty concerning kind of thing there. It's sort of Cuban Missile Crisis concerning.
Yeah, so how does that work? I mean, if the Russians gave it up and they came back, what does that proximity really mean as it relates to being able to spy on us and stuff like that? For those, again, I don't even fully, get that. I figured in the digital age, it almost wouldn't matter, where you are to be able to, do that kind of level of espionage. What does that proximity mean, and how does that work?
It lets, without getting into too much, but I mean,
without giving up classified information.
Basically, your cell phone, the emissions off your cell phone are things that they're going to be able to pick up. So that's why I strongly recommend the use of encrypted communications for calls. I personally use Signal among others, but people have their preferences. Doesn't stop them, but it makes it harder. It also puts them in a position to monitor all of the maritime broadcast communications in the Caribbean. Yeah. So the way ships communicate, all those Inmarsat phone calls, all that kind of stuff. It puts them in a position to potentially pick off signals coming off of satellites that are within their footprint. So a lot of different nasty things they can do. And by Cuba is by far and away the most important eavesdropping site for both the communist Chinese in the Western Hemisphere, and I would say the Russians in the entire world.
Wow. So, Marshall, we touched on this a little bit last time you were on, but and perhaps we even touched on it peripherally, earlier in this conversation. But how does a dictatorship like this actually hide the money, move the money, protect the insiders, while ordinary people deal with shortages and blackouts? So, how does that exactly work? And why haven't other places, you mentioned, Spanish banking and others, how have they just sort of turned a blind eye to this? Is it just, hey, we'll clip a fee and, we keep going? How does that work in detail?
Yeah, well, in some cases, it's willful blindness because they're turning a nice profit, and why ask questions, right? Yep. In other cases, like we're seeing the case unfold with the former Spanish president, Zapatero, where, the raids on his office, generated, and his home generated bags of cash, all kinds of jewelry, sort of Bob Menendez level stuff. In Zapatero's case, it looks like it was very much tied to corruption with the Maduro regime. So you get senior officials playing dirty alongside. That Gaesa conglomerate we talked about, they own their own bank called BFI. And through that bank, they move money through these other foreign banks. I mentioned, Mexico, Spain, France, Germany, so on. Not a lot else in Latin America, interestingly. Mexico, pretty much. Panama, shell companies in Panama for sure. But, they move their money into these foreign banks. And then in those foreign banks, particularly in jurisdictions where there's no beneficial ownership record, they set up shell corporations, and they use those shell corporations to then buy property. So they buy mansions, real estate. There's all kinds of Castro regime properties in Spain. They buy luxury goods. These dictatorial regimes really, they kind of get it, right? They need a place to go and vacation, especially if everything comes crashing down. And they need a place to get there, a way to get there. So they all like their luxury jets. They all like their premium yachts. And so those are the kinds of things we see them stashing their money in. And then they just have their long-term investments in commercial activities overseas, sometimes completely unknowing by the people that have been invested in because they've used a myriad of shell companies to get there. But that's how they stash their money. Unraveling that is something that warfighting part of the Treasury knows how to do. And it's a mix of good intelligence work. It's a mix of close collaboration with foreign governments and foreign financial institutions, and a lot of just elbow grease, a lot of just sweat and toil, to pound through the financial records to get to, the bad guy's money. But it is doable, and it is being done every day of the week.
So, one talking point from the leftists, is that the U.S. sanctions are actually the real problem, and we should just essentially let these regimes do whatever they want. I mean, is the left's political machine here, in the U.S. aligned or even funded by perhaps some of those, communist dictatorships?
I think 100%. I mentioned sort of the Code Pink relationship with Neville Singham. Now, I'm not sure that may just be his personal money, but I think the messaging is clearly aligned with Chinese Communist Party interests. Vladimir Putin has been pushing this narrative that sanctions don't work. And we know that the GRU is heavily into social media manipulation, bribing journalists. They've been caught doing that in a number of NATO countries, for instance. I wouldn't put it past them to be trying to do the same thing here. A lot of questions, for instance, about what Candace Owens has been doing. Why is she going to Moscow? I don't know. But we have to be aware that this sanctions don't work narrative is a narrative not just on the left, but it's a narrative pushed by our enemies.
So, you'd mentioned that Cuba was, a satellite branch for the Soviets, obviously now the Chinese as well. That's become a growing threat. Are there others out there that are doing the same thing? And again, using that sort of proximity, are they doing that in Cuba? Are they doing it in Mexico? Some of our other, border countries, so to speak? And who would those hostile actors be beyond those sort of three big ones, meaning Iran as well?
The Chinese are in Mexico up to their eyeballs in a variety of ways. The Chinese relationship with Mexico is both legitimate commercial, electric vehicle kind of stuff, but also completely illegitimate with the sale of precursor chemicals for fentanyl production. And Chinese chemists who embedded with the Sinaloa and CJ&G cartels, we saw them doing it when I was in office, teaching them how to make the fentanyl. Now the cartels have their own chemists. They're pretty self-sufficient, but they're still getting those chemicals from China. And then, of course, inside the United States, it's Chinese third-party money launderers who are sweeping up the proceeds of the drug trade and depositing it into various U.S. accounts, and then selling those accounts abroad in China as a way of repatriating the money ultimately back to Mexico. So definitely the Chinese are caught up in, and it's at such a scale, it is completely impossible to argue that the Chinese central apparatus doesn't know that this is happening. They know. That would be the main. I mean, China's also in a number of other Latin American countries, particularly, I mentioned satellite issues. That they've got ground stations for satellites in several of these countries. Russia less so, because Russia has just been much more financially strapped for the past many years, that they've had to scale back their presence. And really outside of Venezuela, where it was a big footprint for the Russians, it's Cuba.
Interesting. So, as we're seeing sort of this, rightward shift across Latin America, a lot of elections kind of going that way. It's looking even more so that way in Colombia as well, which had their runoff election, and they have that coming up in just a couple of weeks. What is driving that? It's sort of interesting that once the USAID gravy train got shut off, we started seeing this trend actually accelerate. How much do you think, that really swayed those elections and, the political, affiliations of those countries, over the years?
Well, I think that, all of our friends in Latin America are they're very nationalistic in their own right. They're very fiercely independent in their own right. When you look at countries like Venezuela, which had the best human capital in terms of educated population of anywhere in the region, you mentioned all of the really entrepreneurial class that was in Cuba that was driven out. These are societies that are not socialist inclined. But they're societies that have been captured by the lure of socialism over the years. And then once, of course, the socialists take power, including, I mean, you can say this is also the case in terms of how they behave in this country. Once they get into power, they begin doing everything possible to never lose power again.
Yeah.
And whether that's trying to jail their opponents or repressing the local populations or fabricating all kinds of legal actions. I mean, you know, it, Supreme Court packing. That's another bit. That's what Chavez did
Yeah.
in Venezuela. That's what people have been talking about doing here in the United States when they don't get a Supreme Court that rules the way they want. So we have to be aware of these authoritarian mechanisms, but people reject this stuff. People want freedom. They want to be able to drive their own business. They want to be able to take care of their families. And that's why I think it's not a new phenomenon. It's just with President Trump and with the drying up of the socialist gravy train that was feeding all these different regimes, you're starting to see the dominoes fall. I'm excited about Colombia. I'm hoping that we get a new regime in Cuba, a transitional government. And by the way, don't forget Nicaragua. Nicaragua is a horrible situation with Ortega and his wife, who really thinks she is a witch. I kid you not. She
Really?
tells people she drinks blood.
Wait, talk about this a little bit because
she is stone cold crazy.
Wow.
And so they have been brutalizing the Nicaraguan people, terrorizing them. They've been shooting at protesters. They've dried up. There's no free press there anymore. Nicaragua's a horrible situation, and I'm sure that domino tips over very quickly after Cuba.
Yeah, it's sort of interesting. You mentioned sort of these people and their inclinations, and it's always interesting to me. And I always say this because my mother went through it, who escaped what was then communist Czechoslovakia, and they came here. You can never find someone to advocate for socialism or communism who actually lived under it. Meaning, not that you went on vacation like Bernie Sanders to Moscow or something like that for a honeymoon and stuff like that, but people who actually lived under those things, had to flee, were actual, political refugees that needed asylum. You never see those people in America actually advocating for those systems that they escaped. Only the people who are like, the academics who talk about these things in theory and how wonderful they should be. And, no, communism's going to succeed this time. We've never done communism right.
Exactly right.
You never see anyone doing that actually lived under it. It's sort of amazing to me.
You're so right. I taught a course last spring at Florida International University, and almost all of the students were children of people who had fled various dictatorial regimes, mostly in Latin America. And it was the most refreshing thing because we didn't have to go through why Marxism, communism, socialism is bad. They knew it because their families had lived it. And so
did that, but in your mind, that passed to that next generation as well? Because again, sometimes it's easy. You get in America, you experience what we have to offer, and all of a sudden, if you're not the one that escaped, you can be, propagandized like, academia has done so well and, so thoroughly over the last few decades.
Yeah, I mean, that's why it's so important with your children to pass on, your perspectives based on your life experiences. And, my example that I routinely reiterate with my two daughters, I was in the Pentagon on 9/11. I was actually on the side of the building that they had wanted to hit, briefing the Deputy Secretary of Defense. So talking to my daughters about 9/11 and about Al-Qaeda and about what was happening in Afghanistan and so on, these are things we have to pass along. By the way, I think this is why the American public is so supportive of the operations against the Iranian regime, because when you look at how many American service members served and who either were injured, killed, or had friends who were injured or killed by the Iranians in Iraq, this is something that Main Street America just intuitively understands, that the Iranian regime is a vicious, evil regime. And so it's how we pass those experiences along. My experience with the Hispanic community in Florida in particular is that they do a very, very good job of that.
Mm-hmm. So, if you were to sum it up, what do you think success looks like, from a U.S. standpoint in these countries in both the short term and the long term?
So I think the phased approach that is being used for Venezuela is the right approach. You want stability and you don't want people being gunned down in the street. But you want to then set the framework and a timetable to get to basically those different criteria that were laid out in the Helms-Burton Act so many years ago are, I think, the right criteria. You want to free the political prisoners, right? You want to allow for all political parties to participate. You're not going to race right into an election, but you definitely want to get onto a timetable for it. And you want to stop jailing people, and you want to stop, all the repression. So I think those are the different things that we would want to be sure as we select a group of individuals in Cuba, in particular, and as we look at what's left of the cartel in Venezuela. In my mind, there are some that can certainly participate in the process. Maybe Delcy's one of these. For me personally, Diosdado, I think he absolutely belongs in a jail cell in the United States. He was the guy who coordinated for Maduro to bring Hezbollah and Hamas to Venezuela. He was the guy who was trying to kill Marco Rubio. So I don't know with that guy if we can let bygones be bygones.
Yeah.
But I think you work towards an integration process with people that are committed to those criteria, and that you do ultimately allow, self-determination. President Trump talks about a 51st state. Cuba very well. This may be a case where the Cubans themselves would love that idea. We'd have to see. You don't want to impose it on anybody, but if we have a large expatriate community that decides to move back, who've been U.S. citizens, are U.S. citizens, have been living in the U.S. for multiple generations now, maybe we'll have a discussion about that in the coming months.
Interesting. Well, Marshal Billingsley, thank you so much for being here. Great to have you back on the show. Really appreciate your insight, and I'm sure as some of these things progress, we'll be talking to you again soon.
It's great to be with you again. Thanks, Don. And again, congratulations.
Thank you, man. Appreciate it. So guys, thanks so much for tuning in. Remember to like, to share, to subscribe. Okay, hit the like button. It's so easy. Share this with your friends so they actually see some real news for a change. Okay, subscribe so you never miss an episode. Check out our incredible sponsors down below and in the video description. Okay, it takes guts to support a show like this. Support those who share your values. Check us out on MXM News, where we get a lot of the stories, my news app. But again, big one, like, share, subscribe. Oh, don't forget, check us out on iTunes, podcasts and Spotify podcasts. If you missed the show here on Rumble, if your friends get their podcast that way, make sure to do that. And always, guys, remember to stay strong, stay informed, stay engaged, and, always stay just a little bit triggered. Thanks a lot, guys. I'll talk to you all again very soon.